Well, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Igor Volsky. I'm the director of the Tax the Greedy Billionaires campaign. I'm stepping in for Harold Meyerson, who couldn't be here today. But I'm so thrilled to moderate this conversation because we're here to really talk about something that affects all of us here in the room, and even folks who are streaming at home, and that is the way extreme wealth, extreme concentrations of wealth are increasing our housing costs, increasing our healthcare costs, and even, as we'll discuss, impacting what our children are seeing online. Thank you. The four authors, thank you. The four authors who are here next to me have really written what I'm considering, and I think you will as well, definitive books on this very crisis, and they've approached it from different dimensions. We're going to talk about how extreme wealth is increasing your cost of living. We're going to talk about how billionaire-run private equity has swallowed up and spit out some of America's most storied brands. We're going to talk about the way algorithms have distorted the kind of information that we see about ourselves. And we're going to get into the philosophies of some of the tech leaders that have recently gained so much power in our country. So just by way of quick introduction, to my left is Chuck Collins. He is a senior scholar at the Institute of Policy Studies and the author of Burned by Billionaires: How Concentrated Wealth and Power Are Ruining Our Lives and Planet. Next to Chuck is Megan Greenwell. She's the former editor-in-chief of Deadspin and the author of Bad Company: Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream. Then we have Dr. Safiya Noble. She's a MacArthur Fellow and a professor at UCLA. She's the author of Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. And then furthest from me, because his book scared me the most, is Dr. Adam Becker. He's an astrophysicist and a science journalist. He's the author of More, Everything, Forever: AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity. That title, if it sounds flamboyant and dramatic, that's what I first thought. When you read the book, you'll realize it's all true. It's all what they believe. But Chuck, let me start with you, and let's really start with the basics. Let's define the problem that we're going to be discussing, because in 1983, the United States had 15 billionaires. Today, we have over 800. So what happened? How did we get here?
Well, thank you and all for being here. And I would say we should start by just updating that. Thanks to our friends from Americans for Tax Fairness, we now know there's about 920 billionaires whose combined wealth is $8 trillion, up from $3 trillion before the pandemic. So that's a pretty big wealth surge in a short time, and that's a symptom of the moment we're in. And there's 26 billionaires, all guys, who are over 50 billion. So that's one of the defining things. But to your question of how did this happen, I, in a phrase, would say the rules have been changed to benefit asset owners, wealth holders, at the expense of wage earners. And if you do that for 50 years, under Democrats and Republicans, you change tax policy, trade policy, you don't update the minimum wage, you don't change the laws and rules. This is where we are. So here we are. We're 40 years later, we're in oligarchy land.
And in your book, you really focus on the top 0.1%. These are folks who are, the wealth is of 40 million, 50 million, somewhere in that range. Why do you argue that they're really central to this crisis?
Yeah. Well, I think there's, in the wider public space, there's a little confusion of who is the wealthy and at what level of wealth should we start to really wave the flag so actually I borrow in my book from Robert Frank, the journalist who wrote a book called Richistan. What's the roadmap to Richistan? Is it the top 10%? Is it the 1%? Is it just the billionaires? And I'm not alone in making this case. I think, a lot of us look at sort of that $30 to $40 million threshold is where, if you have $30 million, you're set. You're living that frictionless existence. Your children are, maybe if they have struggles, you have ways to help them. You're living in a cushy, luxurious life. When you start to get above that 30, 40 million, you are not just buying another yacht or another house, you're buying a senator, a news outlet, you're influencing legislation, you're hiring people to help you hide your money and hide your tax liabilities. So, that's where wealth converts to power at a much higher level. And I think that's, when we start to talk about solutions in public policy, we want to zero in on that, 30, 40, 50 million wealth and up as kind of where the damage is really being done, where the drivers of these inequalities exist.
As we continue to define who these folks are, Sophia and Adam, I want to turn to you because these aren't the kind of classical Gilded Age characters of oil barons or steel magnates. These are folks who are running tech companies. So, Sophia, starting with you, give us a sense of when we talk about today's billionaires, what kind of characters are we describing?
Well, characters is the right word. In 2009, I started studying the tech industry and what it meant that tech companies were starting to take over things that we before thought of as the public good. One of those being the information provision resources in our societies. So I was watching the rise of a company called Google that was starting to displace libraries and librarians, public schools, teachers, parents, and others who, prior to that, had been considered information and knowledge authorities, experts, professors, obviously. And what was interesting was the kind of hubris that the tech companies brought to professions that had not only existed for millennia, but also who had flattened and completely reduced the information and knowledge and expert environments to ad tech, ultimately, and that were people who were not interested in the public good and the kind of social consequences and democracy and how we need things like expertise and journalism and an understanding of facts, for example, to have a flourishing democracy, which we were still aspiring, in fact, to achieve. And instead, we had people who were very, very narrowly trained, computer scientists for the most part, and engineers, who had a narrow vision of the world as they were taking on these kinds of endeavors. And so one of the things, for example, you'll see in people who are in Silicon Valley writ large, who are in leadership positions or who are in senior management, especially if they are engineers, engineers typically lead these companies. They are people who, let's say, may have tested out of any humanities courses in high school and didn't take a single one in college, right? People who have very, very little knowledge about society, and yet they are designing products that control society. So I find this to be one of the probably the most disconcerting dimensions, let alone the things that my friend Adam is going to tell you about that involve their extreme ideologies as well. And of course, we want to remember that in the places where these companies have incubated their ideas, which has been, for the most part, universities and their labs, this has been a place where they've also been able to outsource the riskiest dimensions of their ideas and their worldviews and their product ideas into the university, which is, for the most part, funded by the taxpayer and by the public. So you have them kind of offloading the risk through NSF grants, NIH, and other kinds of federal agencies that fund research labs, who, by the way, don't fund us social scientists and humanists at that rate at all. And then you have the kind of, I think the belief that there is a way in which one can engineer a world that is in one's image and that can protect the interests of a very narrow group of people. So one of the things that I write about in Algorithms is, in 1964, we have the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and we have this kind of opening up and a moment where women and people of color can marginally move into management and decision-making systems and institutions and positions. And at that time, we also have the rise in the belief that computing can make better decisions than those very people that are now entering the decision-making workforce. And so you have a very challenging moment now that we're in where there's a lot of obfuscation of power and concentrated control in the hands of people who've always held power and control in our society, but do that under the guise of kind of computing and technology. And as we go on through the day, I really want to talk about this because there is a very real kind of eugenicist vision that gets concretized into the products and into the ideas that come out of these characters.
You just want me to follow up on that?
I do, yes.
I did. I know you're supposed to.
And you do touch on the eugenicist view in your book as well. But tell us just a bit more about the folks you met as you were researching.
Yeah. They're not the Gilded Age robber barons, I think one of the things that people point to about the Gilded Age robber barons, who definitely were also eugenicists, and a lot of the bogus pseudoscience that our current tech oligarchs are really into regarding race and genetics and Übermenschen, comes from work that was being done by racists in the first Gilded Age. But one of the questions that I get a lot is, why is it that they're not funding public goods the way that the robber barons of the first Gilded Age did? And part of the answer has to do with the erosion of the power of organized labor, right? Carnegie and Rockefeller and the others did what they did because they were terrified of, the mob of organized labor coming for them. And so they waged a PR campaign. The tech oligarchs don't care about that. They, first of all, accurately, unfortunately, see that organized labor is not as powerful as it was 120 plus years ago. And second, they think that they don't have to care about it. And instead, they wage a different kind of PR campaign. They claim that what they're doing for the future of humanity is philanthropic. Musk says that he's going to take us to Mars as a backup for humanity, and Larry Page at Google says that that is a philanthropic project. He used that exact phrase for it. Sam Altman says that AGI is coming in this presidential administration and that it's going to solve global warming. And Eric Schmidt says that we're not going to reach our climate goals anyway, so we should burn as much energy as we can to get to AGI as quickly as we can so it can solve global warming for us. And what all of these things have in common, first of all, is that they're pure nonsense based on absolutely nothing at all other than science fictional fantasies. The actual science is not there and cuts against them in every single case. They are just wrong about all of it. And a lot of that is what I talk about in my book, among other things. Mars ain't happening. There's nothing that could happen to Earth that would make Mars a good backup for humanity. You could explode every single nuclear weapon on Earth, get to the worst case scenario for climate change, and have a meteor hit as big as the one that killed off the dinosaurs, and Earth would still be better than Mars because there's oxygen here, among many things. But also, all of these visions of the future that they're promoting are visions where technology is a totalizing force that solves everything. Forgetting that, when Sam Altman says, we're going to build an AGI and we're going to ask it for, and I swear to God, this is essentially what he said, we're going to ask it for 3 wishes to solve climate change. When he says stuff like that, he's forgetting, if he ever knew, that the primary barriers to solving the climate crisis are not technological. We have all or almost all of the technology we need to address climate change. The barriers to addressing climate change are social and political. But what these guys want to do is they want to escape the social and political, right? They're just forgetting, when Musk says we're going to go to Mars and puts in his Starlink end user license agreement, in violation of international treaty, that you as a user of Starlink recognize that any colony he builds on Mars is not subject to any nation's laws, something that's actually in the Starlink end user license agreement. He's hoping for an escape from politics, and what he's forgetting is that politics is something that happens when you have more than one person in a room.
Yeah. Megan, I want to bring you in because the billionaires you write about run private equity firms. They're not as well known as Musk or Sam Altman. Tell us a little bit about these folks. And as you do, a theme that runs through your book and many of these books is the sense that, well, if I'm a billionaire and I made all this money doing thing A, I also know about journalism and how to run a hospital. And so kind of dive into that a bit as well.
Yeah, I got into writing about private equity because private equity took over a company I worked for and it went really badly. And I'm a narrative journalist at heart, but had never really written about finance or economics, but just sort of wanted to understand what had happened to me and why it matters for everybody else, because it was becoming increasingly clear to me that it did. And one of the first things I realized is that you're right, these people don't have name recognition for the most part. I live in New York City, and when I ask people, what do you know about Steven Schwartzman, the thing that high information voters say to me is, oh, he's the guy whose name is on the central branch of the New York Public Library, which is true. He also runs Blackstone, the biggest private equity firm in the world. Blackstone is the single largest landlord in the country. And he was the biggest or the second biggest individual donor to Donald Trump in all 3 of the last election cycles. But it's not in his interest for us to know that about him, right? This is not an Elon Musk who wants attention for the sake of attention. This is somebody who prefers to work sort of behind the scenes, and private equity is a system that is very secretive by design. And so the reason I got interested in this is because I found that most people were like me, where they sort of knew private equity was big and getting bigger and important and probably had some destructive effects on the economy. But one single question past that, and they were like, I had no idea. That's exactly who I was. And there have been other books explaining, sort of the technicalities of how private equity works, but I'm a narrative journalist. I just wanted to do some storytelling, and so I picked 4 protagonists who had sort of seen this system blow up their own lives. And one of the things that workers said to me over and over and over was, until it all fell apart, I didn't even know my employer was owned by private equity, right? So the first story in my book is about Toys R Us, and I focus on one, Toys R Us floor supervisor in a store in Oregon, and her bosses 7 layers above her all worked at Toys R Us. Her paychecks said Toys R Us. how many people would do all of the research before taking a job to support their family to realize that actually who's pulling the strings here is KKR and Bain Capital, right? And so I think that has been really key to how private equity works and why it's able to get away with it, because people really don't understand, and again, that's by design. And then when you start giving them the detail, they're furious. It doesn't matter what their politics are. They're furious that these group of billionaires is pulling the strings for their employer, their housing, their healthcare, their kids' nursery school, their grandmother's nursing home. The tentacles are so numerous and go so deep. And so, of course, they're not really interested in the rest of us knowing that.
Well, let's move to this question of how billionaires and extreme wealth directly impact our lives. And Megan, I want to come back to you. Tell us how private equity works. What is the model? And then you alluded to the characters in your book. One of them is Roger, a doctor who worked in rural Wyoming for, I think, most of his career. He saw his hospital taken over by private equity. So tell us a little bit about that. But first, kind of give us the baseline of what does private equity do? What sets it apart?
Private equity started in the 1960s with what they called bootstrap deals, which were essentially buying small family-run companies that showed the potential for expansion, but didn't necessarily have the liquid capital they needed to do it, pumping in a bunch of capital, and then coming to a lucrative exit for everybody, right? That's a fairly benign system to my mind, honestly. What happened from there was private equity started targeting bigger and bigger companies and also finding all of the loopholes in the law that would allow them to grease the skids in an ever more favorable way for them. So the way private equity works fundamentally is they buy companies outright. So unlike venture capital where you're investing, this is buying companies wholesale. So you get to make all of the decisions. And the money used to buy the companies comes from a couple of sources. One is, university endowments, public pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, all of those things, outside investors. But that outside investor money only makes up 20 to 30% of any given private equity deal, what they call a leveraged buyout. The leverage in a leveraged buyout is just straight bank loans. But if I take out a bank loan, I am responsible for paying it back with interest. If I am a private equity firm and I take out a bank loan, I assign the debt for that loan to my own portfolio company, which means that if it gets into financial trouble, my private equity firm, which is worth billions upon billions of dollars, has no legal responsibility. What that means is you end up with this complete split in incentives where what's good for me as the private equity firm is not necessarily what's good for the portfolio company I run, and in fact might be actually opposite to what's good for the portfolio company I run. It's actually this corruption of what free market capitalism was designed to be, because I can make money by screwing over the thing whose success I am tasked with, right? And so you see that from the 80s till now, this system has grown ever bigger and has gotten into more and more and more industries. So I talked a little bit about Toys R Us, which is retail used to be very, very trendy for private equity. Retail's not trendy for anybody anymore, right? Like nobody wants to be invested in retail. And so you see private equity firms take the exact same tactics that they used in the case of Toys R Us and so many other retail chains and apply them to housing, healthcare, education, et cetera, because it doesn't matter what the thing is. The thing is just a widget to make money for the general partners of the private equity firm. So so Roger was a doctor at a small rural hospital in Wyoming, and it got purchased by a company that then got purchased by Apollo Global Management, And just all of the basic services at this hospital started getting stripped. So they couldn't deliver babies anymore. They couldn't do general surgery anymore unless it was between 9 and 5. At a certain point, they couldn't treat, basic heart attacks anymore. A neighbor of Rogers took his kid in because he cut open his forehead, like classic childhood injury, and they couldn't stitch up a cut after 5 p.m. anymore. Now, this is rural Wyoming. The nearest hospital is 30 miles away and is owned by the same private equity firm. So you see medevac flights from that county increase more than 600%. Medevac companies, also a big area of investment for private equity. And so the ripple effects of losing the only source of acute health care in this community just went so incredibly deep, to the point that, as red as this county is, and it's red even by Wyoming standards, everybody just sort of went, we can't stand for this. We have to do something.
I can hear the collective sigh in the room, and I'm going to go to Chuck now, and Chuck, ask you, in your book, you chronicle the impact of wealth on healthcare, as Megan was saying, on housing, and particularly on climate. And tell us how billionaires are increasing emissions and really contributing to our climate crisis individually in terms of the consumption that they take part in, but also systemically in the way that they continue to invest in fossil fuels.
Yeah, I think what Megan's book does, and it's so important, is how do we tell stories, how do we connect the dots to the harms that people experience in their day-to-day lives and understand the drivers, the billionaire drivers. And I think talking about billionaire-backed private equity and how it shows up at your hospital, at your pet clinic, at your veterinary clinic. It's fusing in. So, I try in this book to talk about the ways we're being burned by billionaires. Your health care, your voice, your vote. And clearly, housing is a huge one. It touches, and part of I think understanding this is you have to get into your inner billionaire. You have so much wealth. Where are you going to park it? It presents some of us think, well, with my little retirement money, I don't want to have all my eggs in one basket. You think about, you got billions of eggs. So part of what we're dealing with is a parking problem, and when it comes to housing, that's one. When it comes to the environment, you have the situation where the billionaires and the ultra wealthy are the super emitters at a time when we're all told, and I think it's true, we're all need to address our role in climate change, our own emissions, our own participation, particularly those of us in the global north, people who have a middle class standard of living. We all have to adjust and change our behavior. But the billionaires are what Sam was talking the other, 16 tons is the annual, 14 to 16 tons is the annual emissions of a person in the United States. Your average billionaire is like the top 1/10 of 1%, 2.2 tons a day. Bigger houses, private jets, yachts, which are among the most polluting. So the billionaire group, the class, has to change their behavior first and fastest. Secondly, you have a subsection of the fossil fuel oligarchs who are kind of buddied up with Adam's tech oligarchs in this. How do we keep a phrase that they created, weather-dependent energy sources? Let's push those to the side and focus on reopening or keeping open zombie coal plants and shut down windmill projects so that they can power these data centers. So so they're really investing in kind of a short-term, take the money and run kind of moment. The next 5 years, can we keep this coal plant open and keep the money flowing? So the biggest harm, I think, is these folks are blocking our ability as a society. They're using their wealth and power and position to block alternative pathways towards a survivable future. And the other way that they're affecting us is undercutting the solidarity that we're going to need to face a disrupted future. So if Adam's saying, well, should I walk downtown or should I take an, trying to make an individual decision, and then Kylie Jenner's just flying their jet across town for lunch, we're social animals. We look to each other, and are each of us doing our part? Are you going to step? Are we all going to take that step? And if you look over and you see these billionaires, it undermines the cultural shift that we're going to need to take. So that, to me, is one of the ways that this is one of the harms of these concentrations of wealth on the environmental space.
Sophia, we've been hearing a lot about the economic consequences of extreme wealth, and towards the end of the book, your book, you tell a story about Candace, a black hairdresser who was using Yelp to advertise her business, and the algorithms within Yelp kept hiding her from customers, and it became very hard for her to really be visible on that platform. But you also dive into less visible ways in which extreme wealth and billionaires are impacting us and the kind of information we see. Tell us what happened, I believe in 2011, when you Googled black girls.
Adam and I are melting down over here because I'm like whispering to him nuclear, because they're bringing back nuclear energy too. And it makes the things that I was looking at in 2011 feel like child's play, to be honest. It's difficult to talk about. I mean, at the time that I was starting to look at, what does it mean that you have ad tech companies take over the provision of information and normalize things like a completely new culture of information acquisition, such that people believe that there is one right answer, that it is Googleable. Google becomes a noun and a verb in our society. People begin to believe that answers can be known in 0.03 seconds, that there is one answer, it's at the top of the pile, and that the rank order of those answers reflects a legitimate kind of vetting or curation of what's available of the billions of options. And at the time, I knew that this was dangerous because, first of all, tech monopolies unto themselves are dangerous. Monopolies are dangerous in our society, but also that you have information monopolies is even more dangerous. And then you have a new socialization of a generation, and now we're like about 3 generations into people consuming information and knowledge and not being able to disambiguate evidence-based research from a subreddit, right, or something from 4chan, and because it depends on how it ranks. So this is a problem. And I wanted to demonstrate how that was a problem. And so one of the things that I did is I took the US Census categories, the racial and ethnic categories and the gender categories available at the time, and I did searches on them. And then I showed how the kinds of things that show up on the first page of search results are really indicative of the kind of lack of regard or care that a company like Google, but it wasn't just Google, it was all of the major kind of search companies, the lack of regard that they had for the kind of efficacy or credibility of the information provision. And so, at that time, if you did a search on black girls, 80% of the first page of results was pornography. And it was porn sites. And the same was true for Latina girls. I know, it's outrageous. Even he's outraged back there. He dropped the mic. Same was true for Asian girls, for Latina girls. And so the question, and of course, there's a lot to write, and I did write about the kind of the sociological implications. Like, how could it be that something seemingly benign like an algorithm would serve up these kinds of results? And of course, these are linked to long histories and a culture of racism and sexism in the United States, and there was ways that we could explain why this would happen. Of course, when I would go to computer science conferences and technical conferences, people would say, well, it just must be because the girls and women of color do more porn, which is ludicrous, right? But technical people actually believe that, because back then in 2010, 11, 12, algorithm was not a vocabulary word that everyday people used. It was a technical jargon that we used in information and computer science. It was actually regarded strictly as math, as mathematical code, and directions that you give to a computer in the most basic definition. And so a lot of us who were social scientists back then were trying to do the work of making the politics. In fact, that's probably what my biggest contribution was saying that no, these are not just mathematical formulas. These are cultural, political, and economic formulations and ideas and projects that bring about a variety of results that have to be contested, not only just in terms of misrepresentation of women and girls, but that really was not even the point that I wanted to make in the book. I wanted to show that's an example of what happens when you allow tech monopolies and people with a very narrow worldviews to do the agenda setting for the information and knowledge environments. And that actually will be very consequential. And I give many examples in the book about, everything from, how people become right-wing radicalized, for example. How does Dylan Roof, who goes to high school and is in South Carolina, even his black friends in high school are like, how did he do that? They didn't see it coming that he would open up fire on unsuspecting worshipers at Emmanuel Church and murder 9 African Americans in a worship service. And it's because, in his own words, he says, I was trying to make sense of the Trayvon Martin Zimmerman case. I didn't understand what all of this was. Who was Trayvon Martin? Who was George Zimmerman? Why was this in the news? And as he's going online, he then falls into white supremacist news sites and then becomes right-wing radicalized by searching for information. And I write about this kind of more extreme case and many other kinds of cases in this book to demonstrate that there's not just the concentrated wealth and monopoly that is a concern, but it's also that they are radically altering and shifting our culture and our social norms and expectations of how we come to know what we know. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room that's had a relative become right-wing radicalized that that you can't talk to anymore at Thanksgiving dinner or at the holidays. And for me, this also, as I was writing this book, my own brother became right-wing radicalized. And so I witnessed this firsthand. My brother is white, he has 2 white parents, and lived before he passed he was a teacher, and here a teacher becoming right-wing radicalized. Well, what are the consequences of that also in the classroom? And so I had kind of an up-close view of these things and how incredibly dangerous. And of course, you want to remember that during this moment of the rise of Google is also the rise of Facebook becoming a household brand as well. And I think, when we came to understand more and more about Facebook propping up authoritarian regimes, right-wing radicalizing people around the world in other countries, we came to understand what had happened in Myanmar to the Rohingya, to people who in India, Dalits and others who were targeted, and the spread of hate on Facebook. But what was so interesting to me is that even as we saw the kind of rise of that and the rise of scholars and journalists talking about that, people would still turn back to Google to fact check. And that became, for me, one of the reasons why I've kept my eye on this company, because it's the banal, boring things that we actually should be paying the most attention to, because we don't really assume, like people aren't using Zillow and understanding, or Redfin and understanding its role, like private equity's role in and what the algorithms are doing there. I mean, I have a former graduate student who's a professor at University of Michigan now, and who studied Zillow in particular. And yes, and one of the things that you see is that the relationship between negative Yelp reviews that start to happen in a neighborhood, let's say in East LA, and what those negative Yelp reviews are white people who are saying like, wow, that bodega owner was really rude to me and I got terrible service here. What the community is actually doing is responding to gentrification, and gentrifiers are using platforms like Yelp to respond. And then that becomes a trigger for companies like Zillow to say that's the next spot for gentrification, right? So there's this interplay and interrelationship that also happens with the mass amounts of data that are being collected and analyzed and are still, I believe, articulated as being just simply data, divorced from the kind of the political, social, and cultural dimensions of their work.
Adam, as Sophia was talking about radicalization, I, of course, was thinking about what Elon Musk has done to Twitter, what his AI has been doing in terms of the kinds of answers it's been given folks. Talk a bit about, of course, we're all living through the impact of AI in terms of the job displacement we're seeing, the energy costs that communities are facing, but at the heart of your book, I found a real tension, and you alluded to this, between what the AI heads think they'll be able to achieve based on their misunderstanding of science and what is actually possible. So when we think about the future of AI, the impact of AI, how scared should we be?
Scared of what specifically is generally got to be my answer to that question, right? Because there are different narratives around AI that are out there. And the one that is sort of most popular and scary is this idea that AI is going to transform into something super intelligent, much, much more intelligent and capable than all of humanity combined, and take over the world. And then depending on who you ask, either it's going to save the world and do all that stuff that Sam Altman talks about, like saving us from global warming and curing cancer. I think his exact phrase was cure cancer or whatever. Or it's going to take over the world and kill everybody in pursuit of some, abstract, inhuman goal. And so then you get people talking about like the existential risk of AI, and people talk about the latter people as doomers and the former group of people as accelerationists or optimists or whatever. And what they have in common is that they're all deluded. There's very good evidence that none of what they're talking about is possible, and none of it will come to pass anytime soon. And most of the leading people in both communities know nothing about AI or about any area of science. The people who came up with these narratives were people who just, were sitting around in bullshit sessions and were basically writing science fiction. Yes, there are some prominent computer scientists who have bought into this stuff, but that's mostly a cultural phenomenon in that the subcultures that originated these ideas about this, transhuman, superhuman future of AI, these ideas originated in science fiction and Christian apocalyptic narratives from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, filtered through mid-20th century science fiction. There is no science behind it at all, and a great deal of science against it. But these groups, these cultures that incubated these ideas in their modern form, successfully captured a significant fraction of the culture of software engineering and Silicon Valley billionaires. And so these have become the dominant narratives about what the future of AI is going to be. And of course, there's a great deal in both sides of that fantasy coin, the optimistic and pessimistic version, for billionaires both in and outside of the tech industry to like. First of all, the fact that that there's this popular narrative that AI could destroy the world gives the sense that it's very powerful, much more powerful than it actually is. And so that makes it sound very interesting. And if AI can outperform all humans in every task in the near future, that means that you don't have to deal with workers and all of their, pesky requirements for things like pay and labor rights. Do I think that any of that's going to come to pass? No, absolutely not. There's very good evidence that it won't. But the problem and the real danger, and this is the thing to be afraid of, is it doesn't matter that it's not going to happen, because in order for all of these sweeping societal changes that existing, actually present AI is causing, for those things to continue, AI doesn't have to become superhumanly powerful. All that has to happen is for the C-suite and political leaders to believe that it's going to become superhumanly powerful, and then they'll just start firing people, as we've already seen, because they think they're going to be able to replace them with AI, and start putting AI into everything, and start using AI and the imminent, inevitable future of AI as an excuse to keep burning more fossil fuels. The real danger of AI is exactly what we're seeing right now, which is that it's being used to reinscribe sexist and racist biases that we already have in our society. It's being used to justify further extraction of natural resources and fossil fuels. It's being used as an excuse to ignore the climate crisis. It's being used to exacerbate all of the awful things that private equity and extreme concentrations of wealth have already visited upon our society. And it's being used to degrade our collective ability to discern what the truth is, especially around AI itself. And that's a bipartisan issue, by the way. You've got hardcore accelerationists who think that an AI singularity and utopia is coming soon, embedded in the Trump administration, people like David Sachs or Mark Andreessen, whose deeply unhinged manifesto from a couple years ago, by the way, I strongly recommend reading. It's not very long, and it's completely insane. Yeah, hot mess, exactly. But yeah. But in the Democratic Party, you have a different problem, which is the subcultures in the tech industry in Silicon Valley that incubated and formed these ideas about what the future of AI is. Groups like the effective altruists, the rationalists, these people created an ecosystem of apparent expertise in AI that is not real, that was sort of ready-made and there when the AI moment arrived with the rise of LLMs. And so suddenly they started getting credence and credibility from people. And they already had billionaire backers in the forms of people like Jan Tallinn, co-founder of Skype, or Dustin Moskovitz, one of the early people at Facebook, who is the money behind an outfit called Open Philanthropy. Anything they touch should be automatically suspect. And so they've funded outfits like CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, and these people are claiming that there's real danger coming from AI, and existential risk from AI is like the biggest problem. We need to pay attention to it. And those are voices that are being listened to on both sides of the aisle. And my understanding, as someone who's not a Washington insider, is primarily in the Democratic Party. That's very bad news, because all of that's nonsense. Yeah, it's just not true. And yet, it even goes beyond CSET, which has like an enormous endowment. The founding director of CSET is no longer there. Now he's running the Rand Corporation. And Rand has started putting out, report after report about, the existential risk of AI. The existential risk of AI, I'm not saying that the people pushing that narrative are grifters. Most of them are true believers, but they're useful idiots. And the real problem is that AI, as it currently exists, is being used to degrade our society and make it easier for democracy to be further eroded and wealth inequality to get even worse.
I got it.
Oh, sorry.
We both want to jam on that. Go ahead.
I mean, one thing that both Sophia and Adam made me think about there, which comes up in my book over and over, is I think billionaires genuinely believe that they are rich because they are smart, and they are smart because they are rich. And so that they can make decisions for the rest of us, they are better positioned, and that we are actually better positioned if we follow their lead, right? So on AI, for example, there are the people developing AI, but then there are the billionaires saying, well, here are all the risks of AI, and here's how I am going to protect you from it. And this comes up in private equity, too, in a different way, so the only private equity executive who would give me an on-the-record interview for my book was Pete Stavros from KKR. And he gave me an hour and a half in his office and was genuinely thoughtful about all of my questions, completely non-defensive. And the answer he gave that really stuck with me, which I dwell on in my book a little bit, was I asked him, they had just bought Simon & Schuster, the publisher, and we were talking about, what you do when you buy a company. And I said, well, publishing's a famously underpaid industry. There are all of these entry-level workers making $40,000 and being required to live in New York City. Why don't you raise their salaries? And he was genuinely sort of horrified by the question, because he said, it's not my money. I'm taking money from all these pensioners, right? So don't you want the teachers and the nurses and the firefighters to have the retirements that they deserve because they served your community? And it took me a second. It actually took me a couple hours after that interview to really sit with that answer and understand why it had unsettled me so greatly. And the reason was because it turns capitalism into a zero-sum game for everybody except the people at the very top, right? In order to pay those nurses and firefighters and teachers the retirement that they've earned, he not only is able to, but has a moral obligation to underpay the Toys R Us workers, the Simon & Schuster employees, whoever it is. But of course, none of those people are profiting anywhere near the degree that he personally is profiting, right? We're talking about one of the richest men in our entire country. And so it was such a canny way, and I genuinely don't think he was trying to be canny. I think he actually believes that he is in the best position to take care of the pensioners. But he's doing that when he is worth actual billions of dollars, saying that, no, I have to keep paying all these people a $7 minimum wage, right, in states that don't have anything higher than the federal minimum wage, because it is the best way for me to take care of everybody else. So you guys keep fighting for the scraps, and I'm just going to sit over here.
I have a lot to say about this because I'm one of those California state workers whose pension gets invested in the worst kinds of projects, and there's actually a movement right now afoot among California faculty in our University of California system to try to divest our pensions from these dangerous technologies, and it's very difficult to do that, but that is one front I think that's very important for organizing, is that people who are invested in pensions, that we, just like divesting from the prison industrial complex or other things that we may be find morally reprehensible, this is part of the work that I think we're all trying to do, is to help people understand where there's power and where people who are invested in their pensions can cut off the flow of capital into both venture capital and a private equity, which is something we can and should be doing, because there will be more and more litigation against these companies. I think last week OpenAI had 9 new cases opened up against them. Character AI. I mean, we could just like sit here and talk about all the litigation.
OpenAI just lost a case in Germany.
As they should. So, you know, one of the things that I find kind of just to extend what Adam was sharing about these organizations that are I believe, I will say, are a grift, that are taking positions about protecting the public from AI. I will remind everyone that the first people to talk openly and provide the evidence of the harms of big tech against society were women journalists and academics, many of them women of color, LGBTQ, vulnerable scholars and journalists. And, you know, I'm in that community of people who did that work. And we have watched people who were the makers of the problems, both inside the companies, become quote unquote whistleblowers and then move to the front of the line and be fully endowed and funded for the rest of their lives to make a grift off of talking about AI. So I have a personal axe to grind about that because I know so many people who are vulnerable. And of course, all of us here, you know, we put our lives on the line every day taking on these companies. It's not insignificant. But I will say that we've seen these recent studies out of MIT just over the last few weeks and months showing where chatbots and AI and these promises are falling completely flat. Corporate America resoundingly now is rejecting large language models and chatbots. They're documenting 30% increase in labor because guess what? Just like the search engine didn't provide reliable information, guess what the large language models are not doing? Providing reliable information, right? So it's more labor to check the veracity of these of the results that these models, and corporate America is saying we can't actually afford to now build our enterprises on these technologies. So where then do these technologies, where is the market for failed chatbots? Well, it's education. That's where it's moving to now. So now you see this incredible push to have adoption of large language models in colleges and universities and high schools. And again, this to me is a really important place where billionaires will extract at all costs, even from our own children who are increasingly vulnerable to sycophantic models that are encouraging them to kill themselves, that are encouraging incredible mental health crises among young people. So the craven dimensions of what these billionaires will extract, I mean, at all costs. It just, we could sit and talk about it all day, and we really need to, because I think we have to pull it down from these abstractions of things like AI and AGI and what is that, and get really granular and specific and talk about what it actually is.
And we are going to shift the conversation to specific solutions. And as we do, we're going to have a question and answer portion of our programming right after this. So start thinking of questions, and I'll come down and you can talk to our panel. I think I'll do this just going down the line in terms of solution. And Adam, I want to start with you, because when I was reading your book and enjoying your book, I got towards the very end. And at the very end of Adam's book...
Don't give us spoilers.
At the very end of Adam's book, he says, well, maybe billionaires shouldn't exist. And I said...
I don't say maybe.
Maybe. And I said, uh-huh. So, Adam, tell us about how you think we can start to really chip away at the power of these folks.
Yeah, so at the end of the book, I do say that we should get rid of billionaires. But I feel like that's a medium-term goal. In the short term, I think there are a few different things that we can do to chip away at their power. The first thing, and I suppose this is not terribly surprising given the answers that I've been giving today, I think that we need to be focusing a lot on organizing labor, especially in the tech industry. Not only because that's a very practical and immediate way to go after the power of the ultra-wealthy, but it also has a sort of psychological terrorizing value against the billionaires. It's exactly what they're most afraid of. And the bad news is that unionizing white-collar tech workers has historically been very, very difficult. The good news is I think that the current political situation represents a massive opportunity to make that problem much, much easier to solve. Because while it is true that the tech billionaires and the leaders of the biggest tech companies have lined up behind Trump, both literally at the inauguration and, metaphorically, the rank and file workers at the biggest tech companies, by and large, do still vote overwhelmingly against Donald Trump and for Democrats. They hate Trump for all of the reasons that we all hate Trump, right? And so that disconnect between the workers and their executives, that political disconnect, I think, can be exploited to help organize them. Like, oh, you don't want to see your CEO just, obey in advance to Trump? You don't want to see your company doing work for this administration? Organize. That's how you get your power back. So, if you work for a tech company, get involved with organization efforts. If you know people who work for a tech company, tell them to get involved. Maybe don't tell them nicely. This is important and urgent work. I also think that it's important to publicly puncture some of these science fiction bullshit narratives about AI, and the broader science fictional narratives that the tech industry is pushing about the future more broadly. And that's what I try to do in my book. But I think that is a way of directly going after the sort of rhetorical power that the tech oligarchs have, and also, it's a way of maybe bringing this AI bubble down to a place where it can pop. And that would also deny them some of their power. And more broadly, I think we should be taxing billionaires out of existence. Yeah.
I think about a few different fronts that are really important. I think I saw my colleague here from Portia from Color of Change, and I think they have done some incredible campaigns and work for the public around taking on big tech. And so we need narrative power. That is so incredibly important. I cannot stress how much we need to storytell, like Megan does, like Adam does, like I try to do, or we all four here try to do. But we need to turn that into strategic campaigns as well, so that everyday people can figure out how to take action then in relationship. And we've seen some incredible success with things like Tesla Takedown has been a really impactful campaign that I think, and thank you to those of you in the room who work on that. We need to just continue to narrate powerfully and link that up to everyday actions that people can take. I mean, Black women, we are suffering that we gave up Target, but we did it. And, we're going to keep giving up, things that we think are important and values aligned. So I think there are lots of different ways to do this. I think we need more strategic litigation, because the more we litigate these companies in particular, I mean, obviously, Adam and I are particularly obsessed with the tech industry because 7 of the 10 most well-capitalized companies on planet Earth are tech companies. So that's a very, very important industry. The more strategic litigation that is active and open against these companies for their harms against society, of which there are mountains of evidence, the more risky they are for investors. So that's a very important way to protect people's pensions also, is to have open strategic litigation. I think that we should fund that. We need to do more work around democracy, quite frankly. I mean, I work at a university. I'm at UCLA, so I'm around students a lot, and I will tell you that their notions of democracy are very different than your average gray-haired person in the United States. They relate to democracy as having failed them because they are afraid of the world that they are inheriting in terms of climate change, lack of jobs, lack of a sense of a future. And I think we're going to have to do a lot of repair work around what is democracy, or find new words or new ways for people to realize the alleged benefits of democracy, and they've got to feel that has to be more than just a word, and so there has to be narrative power there. And then I would just say, at all costs, we must resist the surveillance state. I think people really misunderstand how, what the machinations of Peter Thiel's and these kinds of folks, Palantir, what they're, I know Adam talks about this in his work. To say that this industry is their leadership is profoundly anti-democratic is an understatement. They do not believe in democracy. So not only do we have to, at a moment where people are kind of giving up on the sense that there could be democracy, when I ask my students about it, they say, well, there's no difference between politics and government and large companies. It's all kind of the same to them because they understand that lobbyists own and control Congress. And so where is the belief in politics as a lever for change, right? And so you're starting to see in New York and other places where young people are turning out and they're having a different sense of future. But those are because those politics get linked to everyday things that they need to experience, like affordable transportation, affordable housing, affordable childcare, all of the things that young people and young families care about. So I think there's work to be done there. And then I guess I'll make my last plea, and I'll say that, and we were talking about this before the panel, I think there's a class of workers, of journalists and experts who do work who are very vulnerable in our society. And I think of these broadly as truth tellers, people who really do that work. And I feel more and more each year that we are vulnerable. And I think that's something that we don't want all of the intellectuals to flee like they fled Germany and other places. We need all of us to stay here in the United States and help and continue coalescing and working together. So I think that's another place of that I'm interested in seeing us secure.
The thing I always say when people ask me about how we fix the problem of private equity billionaires controlling all of our lives is that nobody is coming to save us. And that's a depressing thought on one level, but I think there's some hope in it too, which I will get to. So the stat I always give that most horrifies people is the percentage of members of the House and Senate that receive private equity donations. 88%. That's both sides of the aisle. So Elizabeth Warren has proposed what she calls the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which would functionally regulate private equity out of existence, over and over and over again since 2018, 2019. It doesn't come anywhere close to getting out of committee without a dramatic change in who's in Congress, not just in terms of parties, but in terms of who are the individual people in Congress. That's never going to go anywhere, right? And that is depressing. I think what that means, though, is that individual people, groups, local and state legislatures can have a disproportionate effect on what is happening in their own communities. And the reason that works is because when private equity firms buy a business in a local community, they don't go to that community, right? They don't know anything about that community. And so what is the best way to fight back against that group of people? It's to enact solutions that can only work in the community that you know, that you understand. And I think there's a lot of power in that. So I'll go back to the story of Roger, which I tell in my book. This is a bit of a spoiler for my own book, but please read it anyway. So this is rural Wyoming. This group of locals, sort of a ragtag group, poor town in Wyoming, started kind of trying to lobby the private equity firm for years, saying, if we figured out how to raise the money, could we buy the hospital? Could we fund, to bring some of the services you brought back? They would never even get answers, right? They're in small town Wyoming, and these guys are at Apollo Global Management in Manhattan. They don't care. And so at a certain point, what they decided was, okay, we're going to stop negotiating. We're going to build our own hospital from scratch. And I think everybody who heard that was sort of like, that's so cute, right? So sweet that you think in a place with no real wealth, you can just build a hospital from scratch. And you know what happened? They got $38 million in the largest low-interest loan in USDA history in the state of Wyoming. They then raised $20 million on top of that, and their new hospital will open at the end of 2026, beginning of 2027. It's very cool. And Roger, the doctor, when I talked to him about this, is very clear-eyed to say, I am not saying that building a hospital from scratch will work in every single community, right? There are reasons that it worked there that it doesn't work everywhere else. But attempting the audacious solution is the only way out, right? That Warren bill, God love her, it's not going to pass. So let's stop assuming that this other group of people is going to swoop in and save the day for us and figure out what can we do on the local level. A couple of state legislatures have passed really interesting private equity bills recently, one in Massachusetts, one in Oregon, specifically focused on healthcare. Everybody's very excited about healthcare right now, in part because of the Steward healthcare disaster in Massachusetts a couple of years ago, nightmare. There hasn't been as much movement on housing yet, and I'm really eager to see that start. But it really is about designing local solutions, which is much harder, right? Because you need 1,000 different solutions instead of counting on the Warren bill to do all of the work for all of us. But that's the only way to make any progress.
And Chuck, you have thousands of those solutions in the last part of your book. We'll go to you, and then we'll go to questions from the audience, please.
Well, I just think it's brilliant to start off by talking about the place-based solutions where we have some room to move, and linking that to the billionaire crisis. I think the game-changing campaigns are, how do we address the affordability issues that people are feeling by taxing, as the incoming mayor of New York proposes, we're going to tax millionaire incomes, and we're going to make these investments that really make a difference. And that, to me, is sort of the playbook. Affordable housing, tax luxury real estate transfers, fund permanently affordable housing. Tax private jet fuel, they don't pay their fair share, fund green infrastructure, and the California initiative, an emergency provision that's going to be on the ballot, a one-time tax on billionaire wealth to fund the healthcare expense gap for millions of people in California. So, I think the proposals at the national level to tax wealth, to revamp the inheritance tax, the estate tax, defend it, make it robust, progressive income tax, and kind of going back to the beginning, where are the proposals that are going to address that top 1/10 of 1%? A robust wealth tax, an annual wealth tax, a lifetime, the lifetime inheritance or estate tax, and annual income tax. We put in some bold, fearless proposals to tax wealth, and ideally, that's a piece of it, and then connecting it to these struggles. I worked with Bill Gates' dad, and he used to say, why don't we have a tax on inheritances and fund debt-free higher education and job training? Things that link to that people are going to fight for at the local level, because there are these place-based fights, and I think we can. But I think connecting them to the work that a lot of people in this room do in D.C. here around how do we create a constituency and a climate for policies that tax wealth at a very high level that aren't going to happen in the immediate political moment. That's where I think these base building campaigns will make a difference.
Well, with that, we'll go to your questions. So just raise your hand, and I will do my best Phil Donahue impersonation, and come on down and bring the mic over to you. And please just state your name and any affiliation.
Sure. My name is Morris Pearl. I have the honor of chairing the Patriotic Millionaires group. If I can address Ms. Greenwell. First of all, I agree, after being told by half of the U.S. senators that you're brilliant and they need your judgment, people do start to believe that. But secondly, I remember watching the people that created the Me Too movement walk by the big statue of Joseph Pulitzer to accept their Pulitzer Prizes. And I wonder if, has journalism really gotten much worse since the days when he created a war in order to sell more newspapers?
So there are a few ways to go at this question. One is that private equity and hedge funds themselves control a lot of journalism now, right? And so that, I think often people are very concerned about how that has diluted the coverage. I actually think it's less about that in terms of telling journalists what they can and cannot cover, and more about just like, nobody has jobs in journalism anymore, right? There's an entire class of what scholars called ghost newspapers, which are newspapers that still publish, still have subscribers, and do not employ a single journalist. It's all syndicated copy. And there are dozens of these across, hundreds probably at this point, across the country, not to mention the number of ones that have dramatically downsized their staff size. So I write a little bit about the Austin American Statesman, which even a decade ago was above 300 journalists and now is, I think, 19, something like that. So, you know, it's certainly not a problem to have very few reporters covering the state capitol in Texas, of all places, right? No concern there at all. So yes, I mean, journalism has gotten weaker because the business models have fallen apart and because the people interested in buying publications are the billionaires, who want to essentially gut them to line their own pockets. And I do think, you know, I absolutely think it's a problem for all of these problems that journalism is so much weaker. But I'm not sure if this is where you were going with it, but I do resist a little bit the idea that that's because journalists themselves are less interested in pursuing these stories. I think it really is, you know, Sophia was talking about, like, there is no system to fund any of this stuff, right? Like 3 of the 4 of us are freelancers fundamentally, who are just trying to make a living on a day-to-day basis. Not that Sophia's not, but she has, you know, some institutional support. And that is the direction that journalism is going more and more and more. And there are some interesting solutions to that, some of which I write about in the book that I won't go into because I've been talking for too long. But yeah, it's a big concern for sure.
Thank you. My name is Barbara Simons, and I am a computer scientist. I say that because when I walked into the room a few minutes late, for which I apologize, I was hearing some attacks made on computer scientists, and I wanted to speak up on behalf of my profession. Computer scientists, I've been working on technology policy for almost 40 years, and I can tell you I am not alone. Computer scientists have been doing some of this work for a long time, but I don't think there's been good communication between folks on this stage and the folks in the community that I live in. So for example, Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility was created to fight the danger of accidental nuclear war, which, by the way, is even more dangerous now with Trump talking about testing. And there is no discussion that I know of about that in the upcoming, at least in the Democracy Alliance Conference. It ended up joining with the physicists, another group of scientists, in fighting Reagan's Star Wars. Most of you probably aren't old enough to remember that, but the Strategic Defense Initiative, which had this cockamamie idea of putting a dome over the United States to protect from nuclear weapons, which of course will never work. Moving on through that to the creation of a Technology Policy Committee in ACM, which is the major professional society of computer scientists, to verified voting, of which I'm board chair, to fight paperless voting machines. And now we're talking about AI, and there's going to be a discussion of AI at the DA conference, not a scientist. I recommended Stuart Russell. You probably know the name.
He's wrong.
Pardon?
Stuart Russell is wrong.
He's wrong about what?
He's wrong about the dangers of AI. He thinks that a super intelligent AI is at risk of, arising and...
Stuart, the reason I was recommending Stuart is that he's been actively fighting autonomous weapons.
Yes.
But he set the agenda forward in computer science, and now he's walking it back because of autonomous weapons. But his textbook is the #1 textbook read by computer science departments, students all over the world. He's the leader. I mean, he's our colleague at Berkeley, I know. I've been on committees with him, and yes, he has walked it back because of autonomous weapons, but there's no denying, even he will say, that the field has been tone deaf to the social implications of a lot of their work, and that was really, and it's particularly expressed by their leadership of the tech companies, and that was really what you walked in on me saying.
Yeah. I will also just, to defend myself a little bit here against what you're saying, you were totally right that there are disconnects between some journalists and some areas of academia and areas of science. I am a physicist by training. I spent serious time talking with computer scientists for my book, talking with computer scientists at the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing at Berkeley, where I was a science communicator in residence for a semester. There are always people in these professions who are worried about, these things, worried about the way that the work that they're doing can be misused and the way that, the work they're doing can reinscribe existing biases and whatnot. But, it is, when I say that there was a cultural problem among software engineers and that there's a, cultural capture of a significant chunk of computer science, a lot of the people who agree with me about that are computer scientists. This is a real thing that's happening on the ground in Berkeley, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Oxford in the UK. It is real, it is happening, and if you haven't seen it yourself, I urge you to go out and look.
Schwarzman actually gave the biggest contribution at Oxford, $100 million, to their AI and Humanity Institute, which is a total capture of the conversation and a forwarding of this idea about AI for good in society. And the chair of it was the chair of computer science at Oxford. And that it was funded by Schwarzman was actually, it's a jaw-dropping to imagine that convergence there between private equity and computer science at Oxford University. So I think we have a lot of evidence, and of course, none of this is to be totalizing about every person who, I have a STEM degree, so do you. But we're talking about the culture of different kinds of professions and different kinds of work that are happening, and that, again, social scientists also do a lot of terrible things, and I'm a social scientist, and there's space for me to also say that too.
Yeah, I'm a physicist. We built nuclear weapons.
So this is more of an observation than a question, but I don't know if this was by design. I think if Alan had something to do with it, it probably was by design. But if you go from Chuck all the way over to Adam, the four panelists are basically arranged in order of how they see the urgency of the problem or how dark their view of the world is.
I'm a ray of sunshine.
I should be on the other side then.
And you can by thinking about who resonated with you the most, you can know where you are on that spectrum. I'm between Adam and that window to his left.
Additional
That's a great
questions?
observation.
Yes.
Where it's kind of a Rorschach, Bob, that what's
Hi.
your worldview?
Hey, I'm Larry Cohen, many hats, but I was the past president of the Communication Workers Union, organizing tens of thousands of tech workers. And thank you for that comment. And The problem, and everybody here probably knows, is so if I was going to write a book, it would be very simple. It would be, it's the rules, not just the rulers. And there's actually a similarity between what Eugene Debs and the American Railwaymen's Union faced in that Gilded Age, what the steelworkers faced, and what tech workers, journalists, and many others trying to organize today in this country face, which is the worst rules, the worst support for organizing by far in any democracy in the world. So, Adam, we can talk more, but we need to figure out how do we provide support, whether it's at Starbucks, not tech workers, or whether it's video game workers or the Alphabet Workers Union, 2,000 workers at Alphabet. They don't have a workplace for the most part. So we don't even have, in the worst labor law in the world, a basis for those workers to have collective bargaining rights. So again, I'm already too passionate about this, but it really is quite grim. And ask the workers at the Pittsburgh Press, just past the third year of their strike against one of the worst oligarch families, not the richest, but in the country. And what our union pays $500 a week strike benefits, but what's the rest of the support that they get? And how do you keep something like that going for journalists who can't just walk around, as we heard, and get their next job? 3 years later, they've won at every level. They just won at the circuit court level, Court of Appeals, to get back pay, to get the health care that they went out to defend in the first place, to defend the jobs of journalists against the Block family. That's one of the families gutting journalism at every property they own. So I just think that it is the rules, not just the rulers. The oligarchs are to blame, but there may not be that many of them. But when you add up their wealth, as Chuck did, it's beyond imagination. And the rest of us need to figure out whether it's the rights of workers or our rights in this democracy. How do we organize in broader ways so that the workers at Google or anywhere else have the support that they need? Thank you.
Amen.
More questions for our wonderful panel.
I'm Nancy Langworthy. I'm a retired civil rights attorney. I retired from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice before the second Trump administration. So my question is a legal one. And then just as a predicate, in 1976, the Supreme Court decided Buckley versus Vallejo, which equated money with speech. Most people are familiar with Citizens United, and I think they get overly focused on Citizens United and ignore Buckley, because even if Citizens United were overturned, Buckley would still allow billionaires to buy elections. So do you have any thoughts about approaching this from a legal perspective, as long as the law allows billionaires to spend unlimited amounts of money on elections? What do you see as a future there, or any solutions with respect to that?
Pack the court.
I have a simpleton response, which is I think we should continue to find ways to interrupt the nexus between wealth and influence and democracy, but money is like water running down a hill, and you can put up all the beautiful legal barriers, but if there's this level of concentration of wealth and power, the only real remedy is to limit concentrations of wealth and power through bold taxation, through labor organizing and wage expansion to raise the floor and lower the ceiling. And so I think, we should just keep talking about it. We can't, 100 years ago, Louis Brandeis says, you can have concentrated wealth in the hands of a few or democracy, but you can't have both. And today it's like, you can't have an opportunity society in a dynasty. We just have to talk about the extreme wealth issue and how that's what's really, and taxation of wealth isn't just about raising revenue, it's about protecting democracy. So it's a simple response, but we can design all the campaign finance rules in the world, but at this level of extreme inequality, they'll be subverted.
But that's not the it's because of the law.
I understand it's a maneuver, but I think rhetorically, we should be talking about we're not going to be able to protect democracy without taxing the rich.
Just to add on to that real quick, yeah, I think that, you know, perhaps it is time to make billionaires afraid again, right? You know, this is something that we were talking about before the panel, but I know why this is the case, but I still find myself surprised that there's not more billionaire support for taxation of wealth, because taxation's the compromise, right? That's the best case long-term outcome for them, right? Because what do we see in societies where this just goes unchecked? Eventually, the ultra-wealthy get dragged out of their houses. I think that everybody would prefer taxation.
All right, we're going to do 2 more questions, starting with you, sir, over here.
Tax the wealth as a compromise.
Yeah, my name is Liam Connell, and I'm in a quantum state between the Patriotic Billionaires Conference and the Democracy Alliance Conference. That's the reason I'm in DC. And I really appreciated the comment that you made. About 2 weeks ago, my daughter called me, and she was doom scrolling, and she was really depressed. And I said, like, you're doing yourself, dwelling just on all the bad things that are happening is just doing your mental health in. I said, focus on what you can do about it. So we talked about a lot of, you know, everything from, you know, technology is killing us to, you know, taxation. Blah, blah. I think what makes sense is try to focus on the nexus. And so when you have, wealth is power. Wealth isn't speech. Wealth is power. And the only counter power to wealth is either culture or democracy and government. And the last couple of decades in America, there's been a consistent campaign, as you pointed out, very well funded campaign to undermine protections to our democracy. So you have Vallejo versus Buckley. I'm reading the David Serrata book, by the way. Yeah. And so the likelihood of the Supreme Court composition changing, unless there's a major accident in Washington, D.C., is pretty slight. With the way our politics runs right now, the way in which primaries and general elections are held, the likelihood you're going to have a majority in Congress to disadvantage the wealthy is very, very slight, because both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are kind of corrupted by money. And however, all is not lost. There are other approaches to addressing this. They're difficult, but they're doable. One is that there was 70 to 80% in most ballot initiatives. There's huge support for getting money out of politics. There are initiatives in the state Democratic parties, Arizona and North Carolina, and New Mexico is instituting a people's primary approach. The DNC has just passed a proposal to do the same. So we probably all donate a lot of money. We all have a lot of power. I think instead of just blindly writing checks, think about how you can affect the way that our process actually works from the primary level, because 90% of our elected representatives are in safe districts. So it's really the primaries are corrupted by independent expenditure. So think about what you can do about that.
I just want to, I feel like there are kind of multiple realities happening at one time. And, you know, I think because I spend so much time looking at the surveillance state, it's difficult to keep believing that democratic processes unto themselves are going to also kind of solve these problems. Because when Palantir then takes over the administration of government information and data collection on the public, and you know the kinds of people that Adam and I study want to enforce like social credit systems in the United States and control people at the individual level, it's hard to not also figure out how are we going to fight on that front. That's a very important front because we are already kind of working and living in systems of behavioral manipulation, which is what your daughter, and my kids and all of us experience inside these systems that are influencing us to buy a bag and skincare or stay home and not vote, right? Whatever the kinds of things are. And I think we are living through, the first Trump administration was the greatest transfer of public wealth into private hands in the history of the United States. We had the mortgage crisis, which was the greatest wipeout of black wealth in the history of the United States. All the gains of Reconstruction, all the gains of the civil rights movement in terms of economic wealth and upward mobility wiped out. So a lot of that is about the kind of algorithmic gamification of the financial markets. It's about people who are well positioned. And so, we must obviously preserve democracy and our rights to vote and our right to have elected representation and to make policy. And we also have to deal with these totalizing systems that people with malintent toward publics. We have Stephen Miller wanting to thin out the US population by 200 million people. Going back to our eugenicist origin story that we opened with. So I think we have to figure out how we're gonna work on these multiple fronts.
I'm gonna follow up on that with two things. First of all, it is hard to see how we fix this just through, the ballot box. But I do believe we have to fight on those fronts, but we have to fight on every front. And to me, one of the scariest things that I'm seeing is like the billionaires have, eaten the Republican Party and obviously have enormous influence in the Democratic Party, and they're trying to increase that influence as well. Right now, one of their vehicles for doing that is the abundance agenda. Good. I'm glad to hear some exasperation about that in the room. Yeah, it turns out that the money not just behind pushing that book and that agenda, but the money behind the research cited in that book comes from tech billionaires. Also, one of the studies in that book was conducted by Jay Bhattacharya, so of course it's super reliable. Anyway, yeah. Yeah, then there's also the network state stuff. Yeah, the idea of like replacing democracy with like a corporate-owned medium. Actually, I was going to say more, but I'm going to cut myself off there for now. We need to be doing everything that we can, and we need to be careful about the ways that the ultra-wealthy, especially in the tech industry, are trying to capture all of the means of fighting back that we have.
And final question.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing. Porter McConnell, and I'm working with something called the Institute for Secure Activism. I think we all struggle to think of ourselves in a surveillance state, but activists need to be kept safe. I'm wondering if, please don't scare people, but anything you would say that would like make the case for,
we haven't scared anybody yet?
Just in terms of keeping people safe while they're if they're going to be open about what they're doing, to do it in a strategic way, and when they don't want to be giving fodder to corporate interests to like put it on Signal, or just whatever you would say on that front. Thank you.
Yeah, get the hell off WhatsApp. I don't understand why people are using WhatsApp. It's owned by Meta. I understand that they can't see what's in there because it's encrypted end to end, but like they could change that tomorrow if they wanted to, and they can still see who you're talking to. They can build a network of who's talking to whom. Just use Signal. And if people are like, oh, I don't like Signal, the UI is not as good. Yeah, who the hell cares? I am sorry. Yeah, okay, the UI isn't as good. That's true. Get the hell off WhatsApp. I could say more, but I'm going to keep it simple.
Yeah, I think I'm really glad you brought up Signal because, unfortunately, Signal is one of the only pro-social technologies that we have that's kind of working at scale. And we need a lot more of that. So there's a whole community of us who are also working in trying to develop more pro-social, democratic, privacy-respecting, rights-respecting technology. Of course, that cannot be funded by venture capital. That has to be funded by, progressive people. So I think there's a lot of ways to protect activists, and we should be thinking in terms of the way in which they want to use technology to communicate and to organize. Obviously, activists shouldn't be organizing on the internet because that is organizing in the face of law enforcement. That's just what it is. There's no getting around that, except where we have rights-respecting technologies that can be barriers and service protections. So, I would lift the name of my colleague Timnit Jabru and the Distributed AI Research Network and others of us who are trying to, and this is another place where there should be more like the nexus of collaboration of where resources should be flowing into people who are technologists who are trying to build rights-respecting technology, because it's one thing for us to terrify you with all the terrible things, which I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of, because there's so much more, but there has to be counterweight. And so the counterweight is that we also, we do have agency in investing in and building different kinds of things, and this is absolutely the moment for us to be doing that.
Can I just, sorry, I'll keep it quick. I just have one like slightly possibly more uplifting twist on that too, which is that I think, I don't want to say that fear is not justified because obviously there's so much reason fear is justified in this moment. But one of the most interesting like bodies of research that I was thinking about, particularly when writing the conclusion of my book, is that the greatest thing that unites people on both sides of the aisle is anger about income inequality and feeling like billionaires are the cause of income inequality. Right, like there is something really powerful in that. And when I tell people that, non-DC, like non-super informed audiences, they're often super surprised by that, right? But there are so many more of us than there are of them. And this is not, I'm not a tech person, so like this is a twist on your question. But I do think, when you're thinking about problems like private equity, when you're thinking about problems like what billionaires are doing to the rest of our lives, so much of it is just in linking arms, not in a like symbolic kumbaya way, but actually saying when we work together, we raise $56 million to build this hospital in rural Wyoming, right? There are so many risks, and also there are so many opportunities because so little has been done that if we do absolutely anything, we are making a difference.
Well, on that very positive note, and on behalf of Tax the Greedy Billionaires, the Extreme Wealth Center, and our great partners at the American Prospect, I want to thank all of you for being here, and please join me in thanking this terrific panel